So this is almost the last Sunday of our series. I say almost because I have a little treat for you to cap off this series next Sunday morning. I called this series, There Was a Man Who Built a House, because in Matthew 7, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, if you've ever read Matthew chapter 5, 6, 7, those chapters, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is clear that when we choose our beliefs, it's not just about whether we have the right religion or whether we have our beliefs or our doctrine correct. Jesus is clear that our thinking and the disposition of our hearts and our actions, these things combine to become the house, the life that we live in and invite other people into. So we've been talking about these questions, right, over the last 3 weeks. Kind of the questions underneath all the faith questions that everybody seems to be fomenting about these days. Questions like, what is God really like? Why do Christians not seem to be the ones championing equality? Have lots of Christians become too judgmental? And I, for one, will say that I think these really are crucial questions in this moment. I don't think it's an understatement to say that the witness, the testimony of Christians to people in the broader culture has been set back at least a generation because of what Christians have been projecting out into the culture over the last few years. And many Christians, myself included, are reacting to this, to the current situation, if you will, by asking good and hard questions, by putting to the test beliefs and ideas where we've always been told, you have to believe this on this topic, or you have to think this way, or you have to be in lockstep with this theology or this group. And the good part of deconstructing some of those beliefs, to use that metaphor, is that if you hang tight to your basic confidence in Jesus, then you start reconstructing toward answers that you believe do look and sound more like Jesus. And that's been my journey over the last 5 or 10 years, maybe longer. I've said this before, but and I don't really understand it, it's kind of a mystery to me, but one of the grace gifts that God has given to Linda and I and to this church and to this church's leadership team, I would say especially the part of this leadership team that has endured and stayed the course over the years, but one of the grace gifts that we've been given is that almost since our inception, we've been hungry for better understandings of the Christian faith and better understandings of the Christian journey. And I'll tell you something, when you're hungry to see God better and follow Jesus more authentically, even though you may, and definitely are, still a work in progress, God is faithful to help you see more, and then out of that to grow. It makes me think of Jesus saying, seek and you shall find. Ask and it shall be given. Knock and the door shall be opened to you. In fact, you may have heard this before. In the Greek of that particular text, that thing Jesus said, it really reads this way. Seek and keep on seeking, and you will find. Ask and keep on asking, and it will be given. Knock and keep on knocking, and the door will be open to you. It's the ultimate definition of being a seeker after what God is like and after truth. And it makes me think of how in Matthew chapter 13, there's this place where Jesus is talking about how people seem to always be looking, but then most of the time not really perceiving the real things of God or the spiritual things that we need to understand. And he's talking about spiritual blindness, and then he says this confused me for literally decades. But to him who has, more will be given. And I used to think, and then the opposite, he says, and to him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away. And I always thought, boy, that just doesn't sound fair, right? The person who doesn't have anything is going to be taken away. The person who has, more will be given. But when you read it in the context of Jesus talking about spiritual blindness, what Jesus is saying is, to the one who begins to see and wants more, more will be given. Because that's who God is, because that's what God does. So, to the person who keeps looking, they'll keep seeing more and more and more and more. And that's been my journey. over a long period of time. And I just want to pause before I say anything else this morning, and I want to say I'm really grateful for that. I'm grateful that if you said, give me a whole bunch of reasons why you believe in God and why you're on this journey with Christ, one of them would be that there are all these things I didn't used to see. And for 30 plus years I've been saying, show me more. And then there are all these things I didn't used to see. And then I keep praying, show me more. And then there are all these things that I didn't used to see. And I'm really grateful for that. I'm really grateful. Now, having said all that, there is also a danger for those of us on a rethinking journey of getting into what I might call the rut of reactiveness. Kind of got a ring, doesn't it? I see and interact with some people of faith who, they started out asking some questions and they were maybe disappointed in the words and actions of some Christians around them, and now reacting against those things has almost become their new religion. They're in a permanent state of reactiveness against all the theology and all the way Christians are interacting in the culture that they really despise, and they're on high alert 24/7 with regard to those things. And the problem with getting into this rut of reactiveness is that it can distract you from what actually matters most. I'll give you an example. So quite a number of years ago, with the help of some friends from LifeSpring, I cut the roof off our little house to put a bedroom and a bathroom upstairs to make the house a little bigger. It was 1,000 square feet before we cut the roof off. Now it's 1,200 square feet. And so we cut the roof off, we built this addition, and when it came time to decide what to side the addition with, I wanted it to match the lower part of the house. And the lower part of our house is a pre-Civil War schoolhouse. And so it's got old siding. So obviously I wasn't going to find old siding, but I found kind of a new siding product that at least looking up from a distance you would not figure out, like it doesn't match, right? So painted it the same color, whatever. So the siding that I put on my addition was an early version. Some of you have heard of this stuff. It's an early version of a siding called cement fiber siding. It's cement and wood fibers all mashed together to make siding boards, right? And they said this stuff's going to last forever. Have you learned this lesson yet? Don't go to a restaurant on its first day and don't buy a product during its first year, right? Because they haven't worked out all the bugs. So what happened over the years is, along the roof line, every place those siding boards kind of died into the roof line, the first 4 inches or so of that stuff just flaked apart from the snow sitting against it, with the moisture against it, and it just flaked apart. And so for the last few years, I've been looking at my house just going like, well, this is great. I don't want to, and the roof is really steep, like I'm not going to get up there and reside this whole thing. And I've been mad for years at the siding company. I haven't used their brand name, but if you know this stuff, you know who I'm talking about. Starts with an H. Anyway, so I've been mad for years about this, but I finally, you finally realize, like, I could be mad for the rest of my life about this siding, but that's not really going to do anything, is it? What I really have to do is I have to say, well, what do we do about it? How do we fix it? How do we go somewhere better with all this flaky siding on the side of my house, So last week I got up there. Some of you guys will appreciate this. I took one of my extension ladders and I mounted some hooks to the end so I could hang it over the ridge of my roof and create kind of a set of steps I could walk up my roof, because this thing is really steep. And then I got up there and I took my angle grinder with a 4-inch diamond blade and I sliced the bottom 4 inches off of all those siding boards. And then I took a 1x4 piece of PVC. You know what that is? That's plastic. It will never rot. And I laid this trim board in there and I caulked it and I painted up the whole side of the dormer. Now the sad part is I still have to do the other side of the dormer. But it came out really good. No, I'm not going to tell them about the... Let's just say at one point, the only thing between me and a very long fall was some duct tape around some rungs on my ladder. But it worked. Or let me give you another example. Let's say there's this hamburger place, all right? And somehow over time, all this controversy arises around hamburgers. For example, some arguments arise about what constitutes an authentic hamburger. Some people say that if it's not beef from the U.S., it's not authentic. It can't be beef from Mexico or Argentina or anywhere outside our borders, or it's not authentic. And then there are arguments about color. What makes for a good hamburger color? all brown inside, some pink, lots of pink. You've had this conversation with your server at Red Robin, right? And some people are saying that if you don't vote for a certain hamburger, then you aren't really a hamburger lover. Starting to hear any analogy in this? And then there are the more directly beefological questions. Like whether cows were always cows or did they evolve from some other animal? Or whether, given that some bulls have been violent at times, do true burger lovers have to believe that the divine bovine himself is also violent? That's really good, isn't it? The divine bovine. If we were Hindus, that's like that you could market that. Or will all cows be saved? And now this is where the analogy really breaks down, because given the way the food chain works, we know that they won't. Good, you're tracking with me. Now, I'm being facetious, and hopefully I haven't offended anyone, but the analogy I'm trying to draw is that everyone involved in these conversations can get so caught up in reacting to each other that they forget that the original point was to, are you ready? Get together with friends and enjoy a good hamburger. And that leads to the last question I want to explore in this series. My sermon today is called, What is the Point of Christian Faith? And this is a huge question underneath many of the other questions people are wrestling with today. People are looking around at all the things I've been talking about these last few weeks, and here's what they're feeling in frustration. Is judgmentalism the point of Christian faith? Is resisting equality somehow the point of Christian faith? Is fighting a culture war the point of Christian faith? Is marrying ourselves to every belief so strongly that we can never reconsider anything or never rethink anything, is that the point of Christian faith? What it feels like to people is that the point of this whole thing we call Christianity and of being on a Christian journey, it must be something else than those things. It must be something better than those things. So let's just ask it this morning. What is the point of Christian faith? And the way I'd like to come at this is by starting with the words of a guy who used to be against a lot of people. And in one of his letters in the New Testament, he makes a very strong, this is the point kind of statement. There are a few of those across the New Testament, and if you're a Bible reader, you should learn to listen to them. Learn to listen to them. They're like mountain peaks in the Scripture. When one of the writers says, like, in case you haven't gotten it, this is the deal, we need to hear those. So he makes one of those kinds of statements, and then we can maybe, after we hear that statement, we can kind of reverse engineer to find a decent answer to this question of what the point of Christian faith is. But the verse that I'm talking about, and it's literally just one verse, is in the Apostle Paul's Galatian letter, and I love this whole letter and this whole section of this letter. I'd love to read you the whole thing, but I don't have time to do that. So I'm literally going to read you one verse. It's Galatians 5:6, and it says this: In Christ Jesus, neither practicing circumcision nor being against it has any transforming power. The only transforming thing is faith that's being lived out through love. The church that Paul was writing to was caught up in arguments, right? There was a faction in the church that was saying, believing in Jesus is great, but you still kind of have to be Jewish, and we know you're not Jewish. But if you do the foreskin thing, it'll kind of make you Jewish, and it'll get you in on being accepted by God. You know what I mean, right? The foreskin thing, right? So you have to be circumcised. Then you had another... Are you laughing at me, Lori? Then you... I know. It's one of the mysteries of the universe. So, every culture has got its things that mark people in certain ways. So then there was this other group in the church that said, no, we were told, you remember that Paul guy, we were told, we just have to put our confidence in Jesus, who reveals to us the goodness of God and who has redeemed us from all the darkness. We just have to put our confidence in Him. This other group said, well, yeah, but there's this older rule. You still have to go back to the older rule, and the older rule says that all the guys have to, so that's the thing. And so in Galatians, it's like Paul walks into the middle of the field between these two arguing groups. And he drives this stake in the ground, and the stake says, listen, getting circumcised or being against circumcision does not transform anybody. The transforming thing is faith, not religion. Faith means trust or confidence. Confidence in this good God revealed in Jesus. It's this trust in God then lived out, embodied, that's the word I like, embodied in love. Now, I know I've talked about love being the beginning, center, and end of this Christian journey lots of times, but just humor me this morning as I tell you again, and there may be somebody here, somebody watching who's never really heard it talked about this way. But the end game of the Christian journey is the restoration of love between human beings. I know after some of the journeys that some of us have been on, for it to come back to that almost sounds too simple, doesn't it? Like, oh. But we should recognize this is actually what Jesus said. This is how they'll know that you're my disciples, as opposed to somebody else's disciples, is that you'll have love one for another. Well, why would that be the mark? Well, have we read the Gospels? What did Jesus go around do? What did he go around doing? He went around showing people love. He went around loving people. He says, and so this is what I did. In fact, he even says at the end of the Gospels, he says to his friends, he says, as the Father sent me, in the same way the Father sent me, now I'm sending you to go do the same thing, to go out and live out this love. So this is how they'll know that you're my disciples, is that you love one another. Or we can think about Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 13, where he says, if I give all my money to the poor, and if I can understand all the mysteries of God and the universe, and if I give my body as a religious martyr to be burned in the flames, but I don't have love, then none of that is anything. It's nothing, it's zero, it's less than zero. If I don't have love, if I have not become a person of love. Or we can think of 1 John. I know some of you have heard me recite these verses, but there's a whole story behind that, because these were transforming for me. John says, this is how we know we've passed from death to life. Oh, that sounds like one of those this is the point statements, doesn't it? If somebody says to you, how do you know you've passed from death to life? How do you know that spiritually you've been resurrected from the dead? John says, we love our brothers and our sisters. That's how we know. And when you start to hear these statements and they pile up one on top of the other about love, you kind of start to go like, holy cow. This really is it, isn't it? Yes, and let's not forget about Galatians 5:6, which we just looked at, that the only transforming thing is faith that's being embodied through love. And the necessity of taking a journey with Christ, or taking a spiritual journey, is that we must be turned back into people who are increasingly capable of love. Because that's not automatic, right? I mean, I can still be a selfish person, but I'm not as selfish as I was 30 years ago, because that's what the journey has been doing to me, right? So, Fran Lehman has to be turned back into a person who has this increasing capacity, this increasing ability, this increasing desire to love. That's why I have to take the journey. And I know that these days, someone who's been listening to some strong preaching and quoting their Bible a lot will say something like this to me. No, Pastor Fran, it's not just about love. It's about avoiding sin. And so we need to make calling out people's sin central to our mission. I've had lots of people talk to me that way, tell me those things, write those things on my Facebook. So here's a question. What's the big problem with sin? I'm not saying sin's not a problem. Sin is a problem. Don't ever think that my theological evolution means I think sin is not. I take sin more seriously than I ever have in my life. But what exactly is the big problem with sin, really? The temptation is to say, well, sin is a problem because it offends the holiness of God, and God can't be in the presence of sin, and it kindles his anger, and it puts people under his wrath. And my answer to that might surprise you. My answer to that is this. You think so? Because I'm a Trinitarian, theologically, right? One God, three persons, right? Jesus came down, walked down the earth. He didn't cease to be God. He may have laid aside the exercise of certain attributes, but he never ceased to be God, right? I'm a Trinitarian, and I read in my Bible that Jesus went around touching and eating with sinful people pretty much all the time. If his holiness was so offended he couldn't be in their presence, well, then he didn't do it right. The religious leaders thought this was terrible for him to do that just because he was a rabbi. They didn't even get the bigger picture. I mean, you remember the story, I think it's maybe John chapter 7, where Jesus gets invited to a Pharisee's dinner party, and this woman crashes the dinner party. She probably had some interaction with Jesus or heard him speak earlier or something. But she comes in, and you remember she goes to Jesus, and she's weeping as they're reclined at the table. She's weeping all over his feet, and she's drying his feet with her hair. And this is what the Pharisees say. If he knew what kind of woman this is, he would not let her touch him. But Jesus knew exactly what kind of... So imagine what they would have thought. They thought that because he was a rabbi. Imagine if they'd have realized this is the God of the universe ensconced in human flesh being touched and wept upon by a sinful creature. So I don't really buy this argument that the problem with sin is that, I understand theologically you can talk about the holiness of God being offended and stuff. So don't make all my words here too ironclad. But I just don't really buy this idea that the problem with sin is like, that it just makes us such evil, terrible worms that God can't abide our presence and wouldn't want to have anything to do with us unless that was somehow remedied. Nothing in the ministry of Jesus suggests that kind of perspective. Do you know what I think the problem with sin is? And when I say sin, by the way, I don't just mean wrong actions, because Jesus, and this is another problem Christians have, theologically. We want to talk about sin, we just want to talk about everybody's behavior, right? But Jesus said that everything good and bad that comes out in our life as good or bad fruit starts here. Everything. So sin isn't just stuff people do. Sin is the mess inside. So the problem with sin is that it makes prisoners of us, and it diminishes our capacity to, are you ready for this? To love. Now, the objection will be that no, the opposite of sin is not love, it's obedience, right? And I get that. And the New Testament talks about the obedience that comes from faith, and I believe in obedience. So I understand that argument, and to a certain degree I can buy it. For the Apostle Paul, that would have been obedience to the Old Testament law for the people that he was ministering to and living with. So let's hold those two things in tension. Like, is really the problem with sin that it diminishes our capacity to love on the one hand, but on the other hand, isn't the opposite of sin really just obedience? And then I want to take you to a Bible passage that's going to just fix you all up with this. It's in Paul's Romans letter, chapter 13, verse 8, and this is what he writes, beginning in verse 8. Owe no one anything except to love one another, for he who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet, and if there is any other commandment, are all summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. Did you hear it? He lists them all off, right? Like, what does he say? Which ones does he list? You shall not murder, you shall not steal, not bear false witness, not covet. And then did you hear this phrase? And if there is any other commandment. And if there's any other commandment, anything else that would have constituted obedience or morality or obeying God or doing the right thing, if there is any other commandment, it's all summed up in this one thing. You shall love your neighbor. So is the opposite of sin obedience? Yes, but I would just be a little more specific. The opposite of sin is obedience to the command to love. And that is different because when we talk about sin, you know what we religious people do with sin, right? When we're not sinning. What we religious people do with sin is we turn it into a list. And maybe we can say, well, you had 10 commandments, we have precedents for a list. I don't know. That's another conversation. But we always seem to turn it into a list. I mean, by the time Jesus was walking around, I think, was it 613, Larry? Was that the number? The rabbis of Jesus' day had figured out that there were 613 ways to break the law. And that was the list. Man, that's a long list. You have to read that thing every morning to make sure you're not doing it, right? They had to count their steps on the Sabbath because the rabbis had figured out if you walk more than X number of steps on the Sabbath, you're sinning, you're breaking the law. So you had to count your steps so you saved enough to get home, right? But Christians do the same thing, right? You know the old, what's the old saying? We don't smoke and we don't chew and we don't run with girls who do, or something like that. I don't know. So we have our list, right? And I mean, I came just after the generation of evangelical Christians that said you can't play cards, can't go to the movies. Linda went to high school. We knew a girl in high school. She was a good friend of Linda's, and she took ballet. Ballet, for goodness sake. But she went to a conservative church, and so her parents swore her to secrecy. You can never tell anybody in our church that you take ballet, ever, because it's on the list. So that's what we do, is we make these lists, and then here we have Paul. Well, Jesus does the same thing. Love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself. But here we have Paul saying, so all the commandments, whatever the commandments are, the one who loves has fulfilled it all. Love is the deal. Love is the... So if I haven't convinced you by now that love is the end game, then there's no convincing. So, because you see, the opposite of sin is not merely obedience to a list of commands. The opposite of sin is not merely morality. The opposite of sin is the transformation by love and into love. By love, how God gives himself to me, and what that changes, and into love, so that I become a person with the capacity, the ability to love other people. So that's kind of the first thing I wanted to say about that. But the second thing I wanted to say is just that however we dice the current big questions, because there are people talking about a lot of questions, the most important thing isn't actually going to be what we say we believe about all this stuff. The most important thing is going to be where it takes us as people. So is LifeSpring Church a place where people are allowed to wrestle with hard questions about Christian faith? Yep. And is it a church where people can be at different places with various topics and not have to all see everything exactly the same way at the exact same moment? Yep. And is it a place where we emphasize reading the Bible deeply and well, so we don't just think we can prove something with one Bible verse or weaponize the Bible on people in certain ways? Yep, it's a place where we emphasize reading the Bible deeply and well. And is it a place where we think there are better answers for Christians to some of the culture war questions about politics and equality and how we look at people than the answers that have been floating around out there? Yes, it's a church where we think there are better answers to those questions. But I'll tell you what I think is most profound. Whether we welcome and accept the actual people who walk through the doors of our church community, right? That's different from the abstract arguments about ideas. The relationships we build with our Latino brothers and sisters on the east side of Joliet, and the relationships and care we extend to the immigrant families that they have taken in from Mexico and Venezuela and Nicaragua, that they have taken into their midst. I think that's more profound than my answers to any arguments. The love and help we give the people and families that the Spirit of God has connected us to, connected our community to, among the poorest of the poor in southern Haiti. You know, we've been working in Haiti for, I don't know how many years it is, 20-some years. How we see and relate to our neighbors. And by that what I mean is all the people in the different circles of our lives. You have these different circles in your life, right? People in your neighborhood, you've got people you work with, you've got extended family, maybe other friendship groups, or, you know, people you're connected to in different ways. How we see and relate to those people, and do we care about their needs? Do we assume their dignity? Do we treat them with equality? Do we see beneath the surface into their hearts and wonder how we could help, or how we could come alongside their journey and bring love and care in some meaningful way? And how we love each other. Here, did I mention how we love each other? How we love each other right here. A lot of times you'll hear people say, the church should not be focused on anything inside the church should only be focused outside its walls. Well, over the years, God's led us as a church to be focused outside our walls in lots of ways. But when I hear people say that the church shouldn't think about what happens inside the church community at all, my response is au contraire. Because Jesus said, this is how they'll know you're my disciples, that you have love one for another. And so how we see each other here, what we offer each other, the ways that we let God knit our hearts together and we care for one another in this community. See, what the church is like the pilot program for the kingdom of God, right? So in the kingdom, everything is the way it's supposed to be. So then we all come in here as messed up people into the community of Jesus, right? And what we have to start doing as God works in our lives is we start practicing. We start practicing at kingdom living. We start practicing at love. We start practicing at care. We start practicing at open-heartedness, right? We start practicing at working together. We start practicing at forgiveness, right? That's way more, how we do that, that's way more profound than whether I think my answer to some question is more right than your answer to some question. Because in the end, the transforming thing is not who's right about circumcision. And I know, Lori, you think nobody's right. I get it. That's not the transforming thing. The transforming thing is that love has penetrated our person, our being, and begun to make us free, and begun to heal our wounds, and begun to teach us a new way. And then we get to embody that. That's the transforming thing. I mean, I figure, I'm a theological guy, right? And I like these, true confession, I like these conversations about what's true when it comes to different areas of our faith. I find that stimulating. But I don't think when I get to the end of my life, the Lord is going to say to me like, hey, pretty good, man. You got like an 87%, I think He's going to ask me, did you let me heal your wounds? Did you let me free you from your anger and bitterness? Did you let me open up your heart? Did you let love flow through you to other people? I really think that's going to be it, which I suppose is why we get told over and over by Jesus and all the apostles, it's love, it's love, it's love, it's love, it's love. And when I hear myself list off these things, that this is what I think the more profound stuff is, what my soul feels is this. Oh, to be centered in the simple things. Like, right? That's what we were supposed to be doing. This is the stuff we were supposed to be doing, like, all along, right? And I've had conversations both with David Larson and Larry Alich in the last few months about the fact that it feels like we're wrangling through all these questions these days about faith. And we have to. Honestly, we have to. But the whole point of all that, wrangling through those questions, is so that we can get past some of that and we can just eat hamburgers and serve people good hamburgers. You get it? You get my analogy? So that we can just let God work in us and let God love through us in the way that actually was sort of always meant to be. So what I want to say at almost the end of this little series is that we will continue to be a church that works through the big questions, the hard questions. We're never going to shrink back from that. It's too important. But as we do, let's be a church built on the love of God and love for one another and love of the stranger and love of the newcomer and love of the neighbor and feeding the poor. Let us be the hands and feet, maybe better put, the heart of Jesus in the places that He has placed us. So, and while we do that, let's remind all the people who come into our lives, just like Jesus did, of what they really are. And that this good and beautiful God came into the world to restore them to everything that they were made to be, so that they could get their hope and their peace and their joy and their very life back. That's it. That's the good news. There's a new way to see and to be and to live, and it's open to everybody. So come join the party. Let's pray.